Our history books tell us the Europeans brought civilization to the Americas. They told us they were civilized, but were they? Let's take a look at their history from the day they arrived. And who were the real savages and uncivilized people? You be the judge. When European settlers arrived in the Americas, historians estimate there were over 10 million Native Americans living there. By 1900, their estimated population was under 300,000. Native Americans were subjected to many different forms of violence, all with the intention of destroying the community. In the late 1800s, blankets from smallpox patients were distributed to Native Americans in order to spread disease. There were several wars, and violence was encouraged. For example, European settlers were paid for each Penobscot person they killed. In the 19th century, 4,000 Cherokee people died on the Trail of Tears, a forced march from the southern U.S. to Oklahoma. In the 20th century, civil rights violations were common, and discrimination continues to this day. This where it starts. Columbus established the first American colony at La Isabela on the north coast of Hispaniola in 1494. After a brief period of coexistence, relations between the newcomers and natives deteriorated. Spaniards removed men from villages to work in gold mines and colonial plantations. This kept the Taino from planting the crops that had fed them for centuries. They began to starve. Many thousands fell prey to smallpox, measles, and other European diseases for which they had no immunity. Some committed suicide to avoid subjugation. Hundreds fell in fighting with the Spaniards, while untold numbers fled to remote regions beyond colonial control. In time, many conquistadors married Taino women, combining the genes of the New World and Old World to create a new mestizo, or mixed population, which took on Creole characteristics with the arrival of African slaves in the 16th century. By 1514, barely 2 decades after first contact, an official survey showed that 40% of Spanish men had taken indigenous wives. The unofficial number is undoubtedly higher. The Taino genocide was committed against the Taino indigenous people by the Spanish during their colonization of the Caribbean during the 16th century. The population of the Taino before the arrival of the Spanish Empire on the island of Hispaniola in 1492, which Christopher Columbus baptized as Hispaniola, is estimated at between 10,000 and 100,000. The Spanish subjected them to slavery, massacres, and other violent treatment after the last Taino chief was deposed in 1504. By 1514, the population had reportedly been reduced to just 32,000 Taino. By 1565, the number was reported at 200, and by 1802, they were declared extinct by the Spanish colonial authorities. However, descendants of the Taino continued to live, and their disappearance from records was part of a fictional story created by the Spanish Empire with the intention of erasing them from history. The destruction of Native American peoples, cultures, and languages has been characterized as genocide. Debates are ongoing as to whether the entire process or only specific periods or events meet the definitions of genocide. Many of these definitions focus on intent, while others focus on outcomes. Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide, considered the displacement of Native Americans by European settlers as a historical example of genocide. Others, like historian Gary Anderson, contend that genocide does not accurately characterize any aspect of American history, suggesting instead that ethnic cleansing is a more appropriate term. Historians have long debated the pre-European population of the Americas. In 2023, historian Ned Blackhawk suggested that North America's population had halved from 1492 to 1776 from about 8 million people, all Native American in 1492, to under 4 million, predominantly white, in 1776. Russell Thornton estimated that by 1800, some 600,000 Native Americans lived in the regions that would become the modern United States, and declined to an estimated 250,000 by 1890 before rebounding. The virgin soil thesis, coined by historian Alfred W. Crosby, proposes that the population decline among Native Americans after 1492 is due to native populations being immunologically unprepared for Old World diseases. While this theory received support in popular imagination and academia for years, recently scholars such as historians Ty S. Edwards and Paul Kelton argue that Native Americans died because U.S. colonization, removal policies, reservation confinement, and assimilation programs severely and continuously undermined physical and spiritual health. Disease was the secondary killer. According to these scholars, certain native populations did not necessarily plummet after initial contact with Europeans, but only after violent interactions with colonizers, and at times such violence and colonial removal exacerbated disease's effects. The population decline among Native Americans after 1492 is attributed to various factors, mostly Eurasian diseases like influenza, pneumonic plagues, cholera, and smallpox. Additionally, conflicts, massacres, forced removal, enslavement, imprisonment, and warfare with European settlers contributed to the reduction in populations and the disruption of traditional societies. Historian Jeffrey Ostler emphasizes the importance of considering the American Indian Wars, campaigns by the U.S. Army to subdue Native American nations in the American West, starting in the 1860s, as genocide. Scholars increasingly refer to these events as massacres or genocidal massacres, defined as the annihilation of a portion of a larger group, sometimes intended to send a message to the larger group. Native American peoples have been subject to both historical and contemporary massacres and acts of cultural genocide, as their traditional ways of life were threatened by settlers. Colonial massacres and acts of ethnic cleansing explicitly sought to reduce native populations and confine them to reservations. Cultural genocide was also deployed in the form of displacement and appropriation of indigenous knowledge to weaken native sovereignty. Native American peoples still face challenges stemming from colonialism, including settler occupation of their traditional homelands, police brutality, hate crimes, vulnerability to climate change, and mental health issues. Despite this, Native American resistance to colonialism and genocide has persisted both in the past and the present. The transatlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage. The transatlantic slave trade involved the purchase by Europeans of enslaved men, women, and children from Africa and their transportation to the Americas, where they were sold for profit. Between 1517 and 1867, about 12.5 million Africans began the Middle Passage across the Atlantic, enduring cruel treatment, disease, and paralyzing fear aboard slave ships. Of those, about 10.7 million survived, with about 40% of them going to work on sugarcane plantations in Brazil. Most others labored in the Caribbean, while about 3.5% ended up in British North America and the United States. In total, an estimated 388,000 Africans landed alive in North America, and about 140,000 of these came to the Chesapeake Bay region. Most enslaved people reaching the Chesapeake Bay region before the 1670s were purchased from the English West Indies. The Royal African Company then brought about 7,000 Africans directly to Virginia between 1670 and 1698. The number of enslaved Africans imported to the colony rose steeply after 1698, when the Royal African Company lost its monopoly. The number of enslaved Africans imported into the Chesapeake Bay region peaked in the decade between 1721 to 1730, when 13,000 men, women, and children arrived, although it continued at robust levels until around 1780. The abolitionist movement, which began in Great Britain, helped end the British trade to the United States. The United States outlawed the importation of enslaved people through the transatlantic trade beginning in 1808. Virginia planters supported these bans, which, due to a surplus of enslaved laborers, positioned them as suppliers in a new domestic slave trade. Slavery in the United States. The legal institution of human chattel slavery, comprising the enslavement primarily of Africans and African Americans, was prevalent in the United States of America from its founding in 1776 until 1865, predominantly in the South. Slavery was established throughout European colonization in the Americas. From 1526, during the early colonial period, it was practiced in what became Britain's colonies, including the 13 colonies that formed the United States. Under the law, an enslaved person was treated as property that could be bought, sold, or given away. Slavery lasted in about half of U.S. states until abolition in 1865, and issues concerning slavery seeped into every aspect of national politics, economics, and social custom. In the decades after the end of Reconstruction in 1877, many of slavery's economic and social functions were continued through segregation, sharecropping, and convict leasing. Involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime is still legal in the United States. By the time of the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, the status of enslaved people had been institutionalized as a racial caste associated with African ancestry. During and immediately following the Revolution, abolitionist laws were passed in most northern states and a movement developed to abolish slavery. The role of slavery under the United States Constitution, 1789, was the most contentious issue during its drafting. The 3/5 clause of the Constitution gave slave states disproportionate political power, while the Fugitive Slave Clause, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, provided that if a slave escaped to another state, the other state could not prevent the return of the slave to the person claiming to be his or her owner. All northern states had abolished slavery to some degree by 1805, sometimes with completion at a future date, sometimes with an intermediary status of unpaid indentured servant. Abolition was in many cases a gradual process. Some slave owners, primarily in the Upper South, freed their slaves, and charitable groups bought and freed others. The Atlantic slave trade began to be outlawed by individual states during the American Revolution. The import trade was banned by Congress in 1808, although smuggling was common thereafter, at which point the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service, Coast Guard, began enforcing the law on the high seas. It has been estimated that before 1820, a majority of serving congressmen owned slaves, and that about 30% of congressmen who were born before 1840, some of whom served into the 20th century, at some time in their lives were owners of slaves. The rapid expansion of the cotton industry in the Deep South after the invention of the cotton gin greatly increased demand for slave labor, and the southern states continued as slave societies. The U.S., divided into slave and free states, became ever more polarized over the issue of slavery. Driven by labor demands from new cotton plantations in the Deep South, the Upper South sold more than 1 million slaves who were taken to the Deep South. The total slave population in the South eventually reached 4 million. As the U.S. expanded, the southern states attempted to extend slavery into the new western territories to allow pro-slavery forces to maintain power in Congress. The new territories acquired by the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican Cession were the subject of major political crises and compromises. Slavery was defended in the South as a positive good, and the largest religious denominations split over the slavery issue into regional organizations of the North and South. By 1850, the newly rich cotton-growing South threatened to secede from the Union. Bloody fighting broke out over slavery in the Kansas Territory. When Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 election on a platform of halting the expansion of slavery, slave states seceded to form the Confederacy. Shortly afterward, the Civil War began when Confederate forces attacked the U.S. Army's Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. During the war, some jurisdictions abolished slavery, and due to Union measures such as the Confiscation Acts and the Emancipation Proclamation, the war effectively ended slavery in most places. After the Union victory, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified on December 6, 1865, prohibiting slavery and involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime. The raping of slaves, black women free and not free, were excluded from rape laws. There was no path for legal recourse in the North or South. These sick, demented Europeans were rapists, and the country allowed it by law. How sick and savage are these people? In times of great human crises, such as slavery, genocide, war, and disasters, the topic of sexual violence is often disregarded or ignored. As a professor and researcher of sexual violence experienced by black people from slavery to the 20th century, enough said about this kind of madness. Uncivilized dogs they were. History of lynching in America. White Americans used lynching to terrorize and control black people in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Learn more about the history of this barbaric practice. A lynching is the public killing of an individual who has not received any due process. These executions were often carried out by lawless mobs, though police officers did participate under the pretext of justice. Lynchings were violent public acts that white people used to terrorize and control black people in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly in the South. Lynchings typically evoke images of black men and women hanging from trees, but they involved other extreme brutality, such as torture, mutilation, decapitation, and desecration. Some victims were burned alive. A typical lynching involved a criminal accusation, an arrest, and the assembly of a mob, followed by seizure, physical torment, and murder of the victim. Lynchings were often public spectacles attended by the white community in celebration of white supremacy. Photos of lynchings were often sold as souvenir postcards. How sick is this? Civilized people. Yeah, right. What are lynchings? A lynching is the public killing of an individual who has not received any due process. These executions were often carried out by lawless mobs, though police officers did participate under the pretext of justice. How many people were lynched? From 1882 to 1968, 4,743 lynchings occurred in the U.S., according to records maintained by NAACP. Other accounts, including the Equal Justice Initiative's extensive report on lynching, count slightly different numbers, but it's impossible to know for certain how many lynchings occurred because there was no formal tracking. Many historians believe the true number is underreported. The highest number of lynchings during that time period occurred in Mississippi, with 581 recorded. Georgia was second with 531, and Texas was third with 493. Lynchings did not occur in every state. There are no recorded lynchings in Arizona, Idaho, Maine, Nevada, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wisconsin. Black people were the primary victims of lynching. 3,446, or about 72% of the people lynched, were black. Real numbers are said to be 10 times higher or more. These are the people who say they brought civilization to the New World. White mobs often use dubious criminal accusations to justify lynchings. A common claim used to lynch black men was perceived sexual transgressions against white women. Charges of rape were routinely fabricated. These allegations were used to enforce segregation and advance stereotypes of black men as violent, hypersexual aggressors. Hundreds of black people were lynched based on accusations of other crimes, including murder, arson, robbery, and vagrancy. Many victims of lynchings were murdered without being accused of any crime. They were killed for violating social customs or racial expectations, such as speaking to white people with less respect than what white people believed they were owed. Not just Tulsa. Race massacres that devastated black communities in Rosewood, Atlanta, and other American cities. There is a long history of white terrorism destroying black communities. The Tulsa, Oklahoma race massacre is now, due to the work of scholars and historians, a known act of terrorism. Several documentaries and news stories have told the story about the 1921 massacre that permanently altered the fate of a successful community known as Black Wall Street. In May 1921, a 17-year-old white girl accused a black teenager of assault in downtown Tulsa, and white terrorism ensued. There have been countless reports, including from TulsaHistory.org, that 300 or more people were murdered in an act of bloody white terrorism. The media of the time downplayed the destruction of the prosperous community. The death toll was originally reported as 36. However, you don't have to be a forensic archaeologist to surmise that more than 36 people were killed. Here are 5 race massacres you should be aware of. Colfax, Louisiana Massacre, 1873. Despite some people claiming America was great for black people 7 years after the Civil War, black men and women were being massacred in plain sight during the Reconstruction era. One of the most horrific incidents that we know of was April 1873 in Colfax, Louisiana. Approximately 150 black men were murdered by white men with guns and cannons for trying to freely assemble at a courthouse. Sadly, the exact number of deaths is unknown because many black bodies were thrown into what was called the Red River. Wilmington, North Carolina Massacre, 1898. By 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina was a thriving area with a majority black population. There were also several black elected public officials, forcing whites to share power. However, the threat of Negro rule created illogical white racial resentment. The media frequently reported, erroneously, that white womanhood was threatened by black men. A Wilmington newspaper printed a speech by a Georgia feminist that read, "If it requires lynching to protect woman's dearest possession from ravening, drunken human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 Negroes a week, if it is necessary." By the election of 1898, black men were prevented from voting to push out the black elected officials. But the white supremacists could not stop the economic power that blacks had already created. Therefore, they destroyed black Wilmington with terrorism. The day after the 1898 election, whites announced the White Declaration of Independence. They overthrew the Wilmington government, destroyed the printing press, forced out the mayor, and a mob of white men attacked black residents. There were reportedly 60 to 300 black people killed by this act of domestic terrorism. For over 100 years, the powers that be in Wilmington tried to erase the massacre from its history, until 2000, when the General Assembly established the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot Commission to develop a historical record of the event and to assess the economic impact of the riot on African Americans locally and across the region and state, according to the NC Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Atlanta Massacre, 1906. Like many race massacres, the violence in Atlanta at the turn of the century began with white women accusing black men of rape. On September 22, 1906, Atlanta newspapers reported that 4 white women alleged they were assaulted by black men, a claim that was completely unfounded. In reality, whites were threatened by the upwardly mobility of black communities in Atlanta, which they believed were taking away their jobs. This bogus report of sexual assault drove as many as 2,000 white men to the streets. The terrorists went into black communities to beat, stab, and shoot any black people in sight. PBS reports a disabled man was chased down and beaten to death. Communities were destroyed and the unofficial death toll was up to 100. Elaine, Arkansas Massacre, 1919. The Encyclopedia of Arkansas calls the Elaine Massacre by far the deadliest racial confrontation in Arkansas history and possibly the bloodiest racial conflict in the history of the United States. Blacks outnumbered whites 10 to 1. And were demanding economic justice, as many of them were forced into sharecropping. A union was created to protect sharecroppers, and by September 1919 there was a union meeting among black workers. Whites showed up to riot. As a result, 1 white man was shot and killed. Whites convinced themselves there was a threat of a black insurrection and reacted with violence. Hundreds of white men attacked black residents, but many fought back, including black veterans. Sadly, there were reports of over 200 black people, including children, were killed. Many who weren't killed were arrested and tortured while in custody. They were forced to confess about an insurrection, with 12 men receiving the death penalty. They eventually became known as the Elaine 12. With the help of the NAACP, their case went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1923, and they were exonerated. Rosewood, Florida, Massacre, 1923. Similar to the massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1921, a black community was burned to the ground after a white woman named Fannie Taylor claimed she was assaulted by a black man on January 1, 1923. The first person killed was Sam Carter, a local blacksmith. He was tortured and his mutilated body was hung from a tree. Sam Carter was one of many. There are reports that up to 150 black people were killed in Rosewood, Florida. After Rosewood was destroyed, a grand jury and special prosecutor decided there was not enough evidence for prosecution of the white men who killed innocent American citizens. And this goes on and on, too many to cover them all, but you get the point. Jim Crow laws. Beginning in 1828, a white actor, Thomas Dartmouth Rice, performed in blackface as a stereotyped character named Jim Crow. Rice's minstrel routine had many imitators. The term Jim Crow became a derogatory epithet applied to blacks. In 1865, the 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment, 1868, prohibited states from limiting the rights of any U.S. citizen. In response to the 13th Amendment, the Southern states began passing what came to be known as the Black Codes. These laws were intended to assure that white supremacy would continue. The laws limited blacks in a number of ways. For example, some states limited the type of property blacks could own, and in other states, black people were excluded from certain businesses or from skilled trades. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 prohibited many forms of racial discrimination, including in public places and facilities, such as restaurants and public transportation. However, in the civil rights cases of 1883, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the 1875 Act unconstitutional. In 1896, a challenge to Louisiana's Separate Car Act, which required that all railroads operating in the state provide equal but separate accommodations for white and African American passengers, brought the case of Plessy v. Ferguson before the U.S. Supreme Court. On May 18th, the court upheld the Separate Car Act, a decision that paved the way for separate but equal segregation throughout the country. Other laws had already restricted the rights of blacks and enforced forms of segregation. For example, all the southern states had passed miscegenation laws, which made marriage or cohabitation between whites and any person of color illegal. Under Jim Crow laws, states could authorize separate facilities not only for schools, but for hospitals and clinics, sports events, restaurants, barbershops, railroad and bus stations, restrooms, beaches, public parks, and many other places. Blacks migrated from the South to the North and West, seeking greater freedom, but most northern and western states enacted their own Jim Crow laws. The Ku Klux Klan used violence and terror to keep blacks from asserting their rights as citizens in many states. Statistics of reported lynching in the United States indicate that between 1882 and 1951, nearly 3,500 black citizens were lynched. During the Jim Crow era, Ida B. Wells Barnett, W.E.B. Du Bois, and other leaders called attention to the oppression and violence suffered by black people. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and the Civil Rights Movement were born from this struggle. In the 1954 case, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, the Supreme Court declared the principle of separate but equal unconstitutional, thus ending segregation in schools. The court found that separation of the races harmed black children in ways that were often irreversible. European madness and hell followed with them everywhere they've been or go. Just the facts.